Okay, we're ready to start then.
Please.
Why don't you do an introduction, Roxana? So everybody, this is my first time at doing this. I'm an expert in bandpass filters and EEG, but on the webinar and just sort of tangoing with all of that, it's a new experience.
It's really an exciting day today because it's the first webinar after our vacation in August. And this particular webinar was inspired by our Memories webinar, where we met with Jim, with ex-husband of Anna Weiss, with John Weiss, and where we had Elizabeth St. John, and where we had Neil with us talking about their memories of working with Max Cade, working with Anna, and working with Geoff Blundell. So out of that webinar, I learned that there are people interested in learning more about how Mind Mirror was developed, particularly learning more about what makes our EEG so special. And I guess Neil is a perfect person to do that because he's an electronic engineer and the nephew of Mind Mirror co-inventor, Geoff Blundell. So he worked closely with him, and he also created the Mind Mirror 3. And he, as far as I know, consulted Judith and Steve Clark while the Vilistus Mind Mirror 6 was developed. So
right, get the same characteristics.
Yeah, to make sure, because yes, we are special, and we do have unique device that has certain advantages, and there's certain benefits for our purposes compared to clinical equipment. So here we are with Neil. And I would like to welcome him and say we really would like to learn more. I personally would love to know more about technology, physiology, ancient traditions, consciousness applications of the Mind Mirror. That was my proposal for today's agenda, and see what he has to tell us.
Right. Well, thank you very much for the introduction there. So I'm an electronic engineer, and my uncle Geoff Blundell came out with some of the first instruments in the Mind Mirror series. They based their work in the early days from Joe Camille, who was in San Francisco, a physiologist, who was, what they first of all saw was that in the EEG in the early days, that there was something happening on the brain case that represented a state of mind, or a brain state, really. So in this conversation, I'm not a physiologist, so I'm not differentiating too much between something that's measurable, a brain state, and a mind state. It's been a long discussion of brain and mind, so this is really what is being measured on the surface of the brain. So I started off by going to some seminars in London while I was going through college, as a break, in the evenings, and getting introductions to Max and introductions to sort of the Zen meditation style that he was talking, which were grounded in his background of science. So he was a scientist that initially trained with a Japanese Zen master pre-Second World War. So it was a lot of stuff that was really coming together, and I could see what was going on. But then I went off on my career, and it churned on basically, or had at the times, there's this EEG, piece of EEG equipment here with the bandpass filters that you're very familiar with. So you've got the two hemispheres, which is, it's a bilateral hemispheric display. And on here you've got bandpass filter outputs. So these form the patterns. And the patterns are what's really powerful for us to reinterpret that signal, for the human brain to be able to take in and interpret that signal. The engineering and the science behind each one of these is very solid, because it goes back to what we know about crystal radios. So what we're really taking is the brain and the waves that are the measured electrical impulses from that, and then putting it through these very, very standard type of filters to display a very unique function. So that was the early days of taking the EEG and relating it to or measuring the occipital cortex. So that was measuring the back of the head And what Max picked with that was he picked the occipital cortex because he said that's most related to the flight and flight response. And by measuring that, we can sort of get a deeper understanding of what's going on in the brain. So is this sort of the right technical level for everybody?
I'm going to jump into it in, first of all, very nice meeting you. I think the whole history work is mesmerizing, and anyway, it touched me from the very first day. And the question is actually, this is one of my main questions here, and you just touched in it. It always puzzled me, why do we measure occipital and temporal lobes and not parietal or frontal lobes? And your commentary there made me think about the reticular activating system right there in the basis of the cerebrum, and I think it has to do with that, because Jung used to say that the actual seat of consciousness is not the neocortex, but the reticular activating system, which is works just like a dimmer, and really for a light bulb, right?
Right.
So
well, maybe I could just jump in there and say, you know, I mean, I'm partly repeating. So I'm not a physiologist and stuff, and there's the issue that comes up on all of these fields. As always, you can ask a lot more questions than you can answer. So this is really the history of what Max and Geoff's and later people's decisions, you know, where they went with it and why they decided to do that. And to some degree, I can say that some of these things are measurable and some of these things are very difficult to measure. I mean, even the EEG and the brainwaves are very, very difficult to get in a consciousness situation, I think. So the early days where that it was related to the, you know, the flight and flight response, which is fairly well understood from or is very standard medical. They were relating to some of the stuff that was going on in London with Dr. Anne Willie Hart and Bart Hospital and some of the things there. So they had a broad connections with different people, and this is the conclusions they came up with. So this is the areas that they actually mentioned, that they monitored and stuff. My side is really the technical of how you go from the EEG to the mind mirror display, the Cade Blundell filters output. And the rest is just what I've heard. Not,
I might be able to just make a comment there. That fortuitously, Max started measuring from the occipital region for whatever reasons, and that is really the origin of alpha for most of the brain waves. I mean, the highest incidence of alpha arises in the occipital region, but it's also the origin of the attentional tracts. There are two attentional tracts. One is dorsal, one's ventral, and both of them arise in the occipital region. And we can measure both from the occipital, so as people begin to shift their attentional focus, we can also begin to see that on the EEG. So some of the measurements are quite fortuitous, and you know, I don't know as all of that was known at the time that he did that.
Well, I think there was some intuitive leaps that went on, and the intuitive leaps where the human animal is basically sight, a dog is smell. So since sight is the occipital cortex, that was what I understand was the intuitive leap that actually happened.
If I may add something in here, I was asking Neil and Peter Staples and Isabel Cade and lots of people when we were working on the Mind Mirror 6, why the occipitals, and I heard first lower artifact and various other reasons, and then one person, and I don't remember who it was, said that it was because Max wanted to see how people see the world, which is kind of a multi-dimensional answer if you think about it.
Poetic.
poetic and also multidimensional, because it's how we see the world in terms of our visuals, but there's something to be said about this mind mirror being holographic in terms of your relationship of your consciousness with everything else. So that struck me as that kind of intuitive leap you just referred to, Neil, that that made sense of what Gary said and makes sense, I'm sure, of all this neurophysiology that Leonardo's studying right now too. See how they see the world.
So,
Neil,
go ahead.
Okay. Well, maybe I was just going to say, you know, I'm always wondering why we don't have in the system someplace actually direct neurofeedback rather than allowing the brain to sort of evolve, you know, in this sort of guided imagery. But when people are working on the system on their own, why don't we get some system that has some sort of direct feedback, such as a tone? So you're developing alpha, and you can set parameters. I mean, I'm thinking in terms of regular neurofeedback, clinical neurofeedback. But
I think it's, I mean, in terms of an instrument design, and so I'm going to keep coming back to this because I know there's a really big world out there, and what I want to do is, if I can, just cover the base level of that transition from the EEG that is invisible to a visual that can be interpreted. So there is a really big world out there, and one of the sort of observations was just how easy is it for the brain to actively interpret what's going on inside the brain? So if you've got a neurofeedback signal going on, a tone, is that actually useful? And what Max did was he actually used it in a classroom setting where it wasn't strictly a feedback loop, it was a monitoring. So we did actually do this, what we called more bio-monitoring. And I know the wider term is biofeedback, but it was more that something is going on inside people, and rather than have them feedback about it, which people are experimenting with, that they got on with what they were doing in a training, and there was somebody else that was monitoring, another human essentially was monitoring them. And what Max did was we'd go through some exercises, and then he would say, would everybody except for the person on the mind mirror open their eyes? And then he would show them what was going on inside somebody else. And that person, when that was me, you know, you would get a sense of something that was going on that, without getting into an interpretation of it in a non-beta sense, non-thinking sense, you get a feeling for it. So, you know, he was identifying that sort of level. So we're going to experiment a little bit with bringing up some snapshots that I've got of EEG. So what you should get now is the traditional view of the EEG. So this is just the traditional view that you've got something going on, and this in the medical type thing with a seizure. You've got a lot of complexity happening, and you've got some doctors or some medical side that's doing a lot of very experienced type of view. So really, from a consciousness point of view, there's just way too much information. We've got again, an interpretation of the EEG showing typical brainwaves of sleep and wakefulness. So we've got something, again, which can be annotated. People have built up descriptions and experiences of what this means, but not really anything that's in a consciousness side of things. So I'm going on to a typical 2 seconds of EEG that's going up. So this is the real waves that actually happen coming off the brain on each hemisphere. And remember that with the mind mirror, we're actually doing something that's literally laterally across the occipital cortex on the surface of the brain. A normal EEG, a medical EEG, has a large number of points, and its reference point is somewhere in the middle of the brain. It's using 2 ears to create a point. So a lot of complexity to try and understand a very complex organ, the brain, whereas we're working through ways of simplifying that signal to something that can really be discussed in a human setting. So now we come to the typical mind mirror pattern that you can see on there with some color coding. Some people don't like the color coding because it actually formalizes more of the the regions. The view that I heard was these regions can be shifted. So we have particular things like a beta at the top, the 38 hertz, which is very typical, but then the descriptions of what is happening within that can vary from person to person a little bit. We also have it shifting a lot, those patterns. Those patterns are moving very fast. Now, getting into a feeling of what are those waves, at the bottom, we have 0.75 hertz and 1.5 hertz. Now, a 1 hertz is something that's happening in about a period of in 1 second. So that is something that when we're viewing the screen, the human brain can take in about 1 second's worth of data, or 2 seconds. You've got something flashing up on there. You can perceive it, think about it, and process it a little bit. Whereas at the 38 hertz level, it's going way too fast. And this influences the way that we design something in the inside the mind mirror, that we try and, for the very fast waves, we try and slow things down a little bit. We take the peak. We try and, in the instrument, it basically analyzes what's going on in those frequency bands and then takes the peak for that 2 seconds. Have I got everybody with this? So this is showing very, very standard wave theory and science. You could have the bottom, you can see a picture with EEG beating, 3 waves, and on the bottom one, you've got this essentially a beat wave. So this is, if you can see the bottom of it and imagine that this is a very simplified mind mirror, a simplified EEG wave that's coming off. You've got something that's varying in amplitude over time. You've got those 2 dots that are really representing what is being looked at and displayed to the person. Now, the way we break this down in the instrument is we say these 2 waves we pass through filters. And it actually turns out that with these 2 waves, with this wave going through, when it's broken into its components, it's 2 waves, the 2 top waves that are both the same amplitude at the same time. So the bottom wave represents a beat. So what we've got in here is some sort of 2 systems going. In a theory, we would say that there's in the brain, this is a very pure sense, it doesn't actually what happens, but you've got these 2 waves happening at the top that are then 2 separate parts of somewhere in there that are creating the signal, and somewhere underneath is there, what we measure on the output is the blue line that's moving with the 2 dots, and we cap it. So we take the peak for the period of time, and if those 2 dots are 2 seconds apart, that's about what we do. So I'll move on to the next one. Now this is where it's getting very complicated, and feel fine if it goes over your head. But in the technology and the terminology, we call those oscillating waves sine waves. And what we're doing with each one of the bandpass filters for each side is we're taking the max magnitude of that filter over 2 seconds. So I'm showing in the red is the way that every 2 seconds the instrument analyzes, maybe every half a second or something, the way that the way it updates and stuff is what we're taking that max amplitude of that and looking at it. And what really happens in the brain is not so much that you get the sinusoidal that goes on forever, you know, or has 10 beats or whatever. What typically happens is you've got more something like it has 1 cycle or 2 cycles. And particularly that would be very important for the low end of the delta. If you actually had to wait 10 seconds to be able to see anything, you really wouldn't be able to get a sense of what's going on inside somebody. So when the neurons are all firing in their own way, they're all doing something, but they seem to collect together in essentially these waves of electrical activity that we can measure, and then the instrument decodes them into the various filters, into the filter band passes, and takes the max amplitude of it. Does that work for everybody, that description? That's a very deep technical side, Gary. Does that work for you?
Yeah, that works. Yeah, I follow you.
Okay, good. So now I'll go on to a little bit more on the technical side here. Here are the Cade Blundell frequencies. and it's very technical. You really don't need to pick up on it unless somebody else is wanting to compare the results of what's going on with the mind mirror frequency. So the mind mirror is really the name of it, but underneath it, it's the Cade Blundell frequencies that they've come up with, and these follow a natural progression. This is something that Geoff picked up on, is that, you know, for 0.7 hertz, we have half a hertz bandwidth. That's in there, 0.5 to 1.0. Whereas at 38 hertz, we go from 34 hertz to 44 hertz. So we have a 10 hertz bandwidth. So we go from the bottom end of the spectrum at 1 hertz to 10 hertz. And that's a very natural progression. And that's what happens in nature. So this is the core of the displays that everybody learns, is what comes out of this. If we change these frequencies, then you're changing the analysis that the instrument does and the patterns.
Hey, Neil, what do you mean that's what happens in nature?
So nature is typically logarithmic in things. Nature is very rarely linear. So an example is our eyes. You know, we had the recent eclipse here, at least in the United States and other places. You don't want to look at the intensity of the sun because it'll burn your eyes. It's so intense. But our normal light around us is all reflected light, and yet we can see moonlight if the light is very low. So the eye works on what's called a logarithmic basis. It's very good at the low end of the range, and then it reduces intensely at the upper end of the range. It's a technical thing. I don't know how to explain it in more depth, but log E particularly appears in all sorts of forms in nature. Is that okay? I just have to leave it as a statement.
So it's logarithmic.
Thank you.
So what you're saying is that the progression here is logarithmic.
The progression is, I'm actually just saying, I'll back off that. I'm just saying log E is something that exists in nature, logarithmic progressions. And what we have in this, in our range is at the bottom end of the frequency range, the 0.7, the delta end, we have a 1 hertz bandwidth. And at the top end, we have a 10 hertz bandwidth. Now, this becomes very important when we switch to the other series of technologies out there called fast Fourier transforms. Yeah. Because fast Fourier transforms that are thrown in on a lot of pieces of equipment are not are all a simple same frequency increment. So the way that FFT works is you have to pick the same frequency bandwidth for your bin, for your frequency bin. So you would have the same at 0.75 hertz and the same at 38 hertz. And they wouldn't be, you know, you couldn't therefore make a 1 hertz at 0.75 hertz. You'd have to choose something like 3 hertz at 0.75 and 3 hertz at 38 hertz. So I'm just using that. I'm just saying that sounds strange, all this discussion, but it becomes a problem when you compare it, or it becomes an issue when you compare it against an FFT. So we did a lot of analysis on this in the 80s because we wanted to make sure we understood why FFTs were giving us something that we really didn't relate to. So
how does the Vilistus compensate for this?
So Vilistus implements this. Vilistus uses these frequencies, bandpass filters.
Okay, so it's still working on FFT?
No, it's working on a numerical bandpass filter.
Oh, okay.
So the bandpass filters are implemented in software.
Can I just say something here? Is that because of these studies we were doing with the Monroe Institute, we had to dig very deeply into the differences here that Neil's showing us between the mind mirror channels and the FFT channels. And what Steve Clark finally said that I think I understood, check me on this, Neil, is that FFT is averaging, where the mind mirror is taking the highest amplitude. Is that right?
So the mind mirror is taking the highest amplitude of a one cycle that goes through the system. The
Yes.
FFT is doing something else, and we could use words like averaging it over 10 hertz, but I'll show you on the next slide, or our next slide, a couple of slides on, that it's just different. And we could use the words averaging, but I really don't know. It's doing something different. It's displaying something, but from a technical analysis, we know that the FFT will return an accurate result if you've got like 10 waves. So the fast Fourier transform, which comes from the Fourier transform, which was a French mathematician looking at those original waves that I was talking about at the beginning, the Fourier transform assumes that the waves go on for infinity. The fast Fourier transform reduces infinity to about 10 waves. But the mind mirror does an analysis in one wave, which is very significant for under alpha. So when you've got 8 hertz and under, or even 4 hertz and under, becomes very significant, because at the 38 hertz, you could almost get 10 waves in, in a human perception where it's doing an analysis. But you wouldn't get the natural logarithmic, you wouldn't get the natural variation of the bandwidth. Fast Fourier is just 1 hertz. It's just one single bin for the frequencies that you choose.
So this would create a bit of a complication for the clinical neurofeedback that's using the FFT. Right.
And that's why I've gone into it in so much depth, is that they are different. And I can go, I'll show you on the next screen. Shall I show you on the next screen? So this is the previous screens, if you remember, I've said on a chirp coming through the system, we pick up on the max bandwidth. And if you see that it's about at 1 wavelength long, so this is partly the delay of going through the filter. We've got the hertz at the top, the 5 hertz chirp, which is just an example. And this is a mathematical model that I actually used. I ran this on some real bandpass filters and some real FFTs to be able to get a feeling for what they were doing and their outputs. So what we see is that on the 5 hertz chirp, is that for the first wave that comes through, which represents a collection of neuron activity of some sort, and it relates to something going on inside somebody's head, we can pick up on the max magnitude very quickly within the bandwidth of that filter, within the time period, the 1 hertz or the 1 over 38 hertz. We can pick up very quickly on that, and then we extend it to the time period that we want to display on the screen. So that's the 5 hertz, and we apply that for each of these frequencies that are going. So each bandpass has this max amplitude. Now, when we take the same signal from putting through a fast Fourier transform, so on the bottom, I've switched them around here, but on the bottom we have the sinusoidal signal. What we have for these signals that go on for a long time is we detect the 5 hertz. So you see there we've got 4.99 hertz. So this was directly from a computational model that I used, and the frequency comes out as 5 hertz. So if you have, particularly in military applications, you send out a sonar pulse, and this is where a lot of fast Fourier transform comes from. You send out a very pure pulse of radio waves. You're going to get back a number, hundreds, thousands of those waves, and you can literally pick up very accurately on what those frequencies are, like in this case 5 hertz. But when we apply a chirp to it, so we've got the 5 hertz sine wave representing a pure theoretical view that the military can use, to more what the brain has, the 5 hertz chirp is something that goes on, maybe even not a chirp, but a chirp was something mathematically that was possible to produce. What we get is that the FFT output suddenly says, for that chirp there, gee, it's actually 2.75 hertz, and it's only 0.5 units high. So you can see that for 2 or 3 waves here, the chirp, the fast Fourier transform just isn't doing it. It's doing something. Does that answer the question? And this is empirical. You know, this is just what the fast Fourier transform does. And I've had this out on the net for anybody who wants to look at it.
From what I understood here is that fast Fourier transform is the FFT is projecting the future. What it estimates is the actual based on the activity that is being read, so it can be able to keep tracking it. It estimates in the future what the system should be doing, and this is an hypothetical projection.
No. So it's only analyzing the past.
Oh, the past.
So I know the sort of the screen here, one looks at something going on, but you've got to say that the input to the FFT is historical. So
yes.
you're taking a certain amount of data. So under the pure sense of the word here, under the pure sort of thing, where it says 1, that is where you are feeding into the FFT all the stuff that's happened in the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 waves that have happened in the past.
Okay, that's why it has a time lag there.
Right.
Yeah, okay.
Has more of a time lag. It has a longer lag in it. And, you know, if you're using radar of megahertz as opposed to hertz, if they're going 1,000,000 times faster, then in the radio signal, FFT is fine. You know, who cares if it takes 2 or 3 thousandths of a second? You know, if you've got 2 or 3 thousand radio waves coming in. But when it's a human brainwave, if you have to wait 2,000 seconds, you know, somebody's already gone to sleep or had an epiphany or something or the other. But I mean, I think we figured out that roughly you need 10 of a waves, pure waves, for the FFT to have the same effect, to essentially for the mind mirror, for the bandpass filters, and the FFT to come into coordinates, to have a similar result. But again, the FFT, because it's because of its nature, it has to have uniform bins from the start to the end. So if you're saying start at 1 hertz or half a hertz and end at 44 hertz, you would have to choose the same bandwidth for each of the bins that you're looking at for the fast Fourier transform. So it's you know, the transform is a particular set of glasses. It's a particular view of the electrical activity, and it's understanding what is that transform, how is it working. You know, you can't tweak it too much. It's empirical what it's doing.
Would it be possible then with these bandpass filters to drop below delta into sub-delta, say to 0.01 to 0.1 hertz?
The answer is anything is possible. It's just who wants to do it? Once you do transition into different types of problems under 1 hertz.
Yeah.
So the half a hertz is a sort of significant wavelength. And again, it was something that Geoff picked up on, I think, you know, in their trying to do, in their specification in the 70s of going for a, what frequencies can we use? That was where they started at, because the technology they could do it with the technology. So half a hertz at the bottom end to 44 hertz. 44 hertz was just below 50 hertz, which is where you get a lot of interference at 50 hertz and stuff. So you've got other activities start coming in at beneath 0.1 hertz, beneath 0.5 hertz. And particularly, I think you get more stomach activity that happens. If you were measuring the stomach, you know, you've got thinking that goes on at different levels.
Okay, yeah, I'm just thinking about what the Offmers do, but I think they're using a FFT in a strange sort of way to monitor, you know, sub-delta. So it's a complication. Just wondering about the possibilities of doing that with a mind mirror type of bandpass filter.
Right. So you've got to look at not only, I mean, the FFT is doing something, but you've got to look at all the pre-amplification circuitry as well. So It's more difficult to amplify, or it's a different type of amplification to start going down to those lower frequencies to be able to keep
I
a
mentioned
steady.
that to Steve, and he just kind of threw up his hands and said, "If you want to put in another few $1,000s."
Well, that's what I mean. You know,
Yeah.
so it's where is the call, and you know that's part of the process of scientific endeavor. Is like, well, this is an area, but you've got to make a basis for it. You've got to say why that is important, or have a model that says, well, something seems like it's happening down there that we could be looking at, and then somebody's got to either agree with it in some way and come up with the energy. So we've got to, you know, we've got synergies happening of people who have got the technical expertise, like myself and Geoff initially, and Max Cade, and the other people that were working, and now Judith and Oksana and Vilistus, Steve. You know, so you've got different synergies that are going on people bringing different skills to essentially the investigation and the team.
One thing that we had to kind of read through in the old Mind Mirror, the 3 that we used a lot. I'm much more familiar with that than I am with Vilistus, but with the 3, we would get a huge, you know, display at 38. And we would have to read through that and decide whether or not it was actually coming from 40 or 42 hertz, and ask the person, you know, what's going on here, because it could be, if it's lower beta, it could be, you know, worrying, monkey mind, you know, that sort of thing, or it could be intense focus concentration if it's around 40, 42 hertz. So it was, you know, it's nice that the Vilistus kind of breaks that down into a little finer detail that allows us to see that.
Well, you know, that's certainly with the software filters, we can, it's possible now, and with the processing power, I mean, the enormous change in processing power, it's possible to do a lot more, and you could break down the filters even further if there was a need, you know, just from a technical point of view. But somebody makes that call, and you know, at the moment, all I'm sort of talking about is the call that was made in the past and how it got there. Now, you know, what Steve and Judith are doing is great, and so I mean, yeah, it's interesting, but there's always more questions, and that's the process of investigating, and it's stuff there. So shall I go on any more? I mean, this is a fundamental thing, and I'm glad it's brought up that people have seen the FFT being used, because this is the level where they don't correspond. They give something different, and it's not. And if all the work is done on the FFT, then there's probably, you know, there's a track record, there's a history of what people are finding. But you could also expect that on the FFTs, it wouldn't pick up on anything, any events that are happening, let's say sub 8 hertz very well, because any of those lower frequencies, the FFT is going to kind of go, oh, I didn't see it, I averaged it.
That makes me wonder, Neil, if that's why all the neurofeedback people who have been using FFT all this time would say that there's no such thing as waking delta.
Well, I mean, again, I can show, you know, see that display of what an FFT will show you with a couple of cycles. So if you're seeing a couple of cycles of delta come up for whatever the person's state is, the FFT is just not going to see it, you know, and that's built into the transform and the algorithm. And, you know, it means that essentially it's the, you know, the perceptive, the tools you're using don't show it. And I'm happy to talk about that with anybody, because we put a lot of work to make sure we understood why the, you know, where the bandpass filters worked and where the FFT worked.
I'm glad to get this background, because it makes me more excited about using the you know, the Mind Mirror, and to be able to explain it a little bit better to people. You know, I can't go into the technical detail that you are going into now, but at least to let people know that there is a distinct difference in working with the FFT or the Mind Mirror, and why that difference is there.
And the core part is that the FFT expects a history of about 10 waves. So it has to have those 10 cycles in there as a measurement history to start picking up on the amplitude. And that if you just have that simple, what I describe as a chirp function, which is an approximation to what might be going on in the head. It's you know, it was just to test the filters out. It just gives you something that it's an average, but it doesn't even indicate on the same frequency.
So this is getting into why ours is more real time. Why the Mind Mirror is monitoring more in real time, because it's not requiring those 10 waves before
Right.
it.
Right. So the response time of the Mind Mirror is in the order of the magnitude of the bandwidth, the bandwidth of the filter. So that's where those numbers also become important that I pointed out. So these are all standard classic analysis of issues with filters. So down at the 1 Hertz level, the response time of that filter is 1 second, which we can cope with. You know, that is a visualization. That's visualizing that electrical signal is then being visualized in terms of the amplitude. When you're up at the 38 Hertz level with a 10 Hertz bandwidth, now the response time is faster. So it's 1/10 of a second. It's picking up on stuff that's going through. So if the brain is doing the beta up and down, you know, it picks up on it with 1/10 of a second, which is fantastic. And then we stretch it so that if there's just a burst of beta, you get to see it. You get to see the maximum amplitude that's on there. And so, you know, this comes back to the other level of characterization that happened early on with the Mind Mirror, that Geoff, as the filters expert, was working with Max and could see what we were trying to look at. So starting with the Joe Camille sort of, you know, I can pick up on a couple of frequencies of people meditating. You know, now Geoff was putting in more band passes that were in there, and they were at that time had coming through London, some of the Tibetans who were leaving Tibet and stuff, and they were putting them on them and asking them questions, you know, well, what do you think? What does this display? How does it relate to what's going on in your meditational tradition? So they were able to really take those signals that were coming out of the Mind Mirror and calibrate them and come up with a language at the time with human consciousness type stuff. So, you know, the consciousness or the brain states, the mind states that Max was at that time trying to tease out. He was sort of seeing this data coming through. He was putting it on people and seeing consistent results. And then I know they were taking some of that data and presenting it to some of the EEG experts of the day, who were very intrigued by it. You know, so there were the medical EEG experts because they had the big EEG experiments. They had the big EEG equipment, but they weren't measuring meditators. They weren't measuring people in a healthy state of consciousness. So they were seeing different types of things, but they had the models of the brain. They have, and still do today, you know, they're pioneering the models of what's going on in the functions of the brain, really from a disease perspective. You know, what goes wrong? Because when it goes wrong, we really want to fix that. But from a human consciousness point of view, it's a different lens, I think, that the Mind Mirror gives. So it's all very interesting, very exciting. I mean, it's just looking at the differences, very specific type of area of monitoring, and monitoring it in a different way. So the fast Fourier transform has a long history within hospitals and with elsewhere where people are using them, and people relate to that history of what research they've got and what happens to things. But it's really hard for non-technical people to get into, including the medics, to get into what exactly does the equipment do at times, you know, because it's a synergy of different levels of experience.
I remember talking to one biofeedback or neurofeedback engineer who was still using the old GRASP system with fast Fourier. And he looked at the Mind Mirror and said, oh, well, that's just a toy, and dismissed the whole thing.
It's just what? It's just
a toy.
Yes, well, it's 2 channels.
Yeah.
But it's portable. So, you know, from their point of view, if you've got 32 channels, you know, it's a bit more of a it's not as complex and stuff, but it's
Well, they were trying to look at consciousness the same way we do, and coming up with reams and reams and reams of paper that they had to like sort through to even begin to understand what they were doing. So they just couldn't quite grasp the fact that the mind mirror was doing what they wanted to do, but doing it a lot more simply and faster.
Right. And so, you know, it relates to as well that the mind mirror does it on the occipital cortex. So unless you make that assumption that some of the consciousness is most measurable from the occipital cortex, you know, but I'm in deep water at that point. I mean, this is history and stuff. I don't know where we are right now on that.
You know, Neil, it's exciting to hear you say about how they made the subjective-objective match with the Tibetans and saying, okay, how does this relate to the... So literally the Tibetan, I guess, monks or masters, the act of making that subjective-objective match with them set the precedent for what we do, which is always to look for the subjective-objective match, because, you know, we look at these patterns and they could mean any number of things, but suddenly when the person tells us their experience, then they mean everything, and then we see exactly what they mean. But then I have a question for you.
Okay.
Why do you think the pattern ended up in such a humanoid shape, that the awakened mind pattern ended up shaped like a person with the alpha and the arms and the theta and the hips and the delta and the little skirt, and you've even got a head here? I mean, was this just an accident?
Well, I think that I'm just going to speak from what I understand of it. That was the empirical data that came up. So once you get a pattern and you get some human humor to it, or some human, you know, you get the scientific process annotating it, you now give it descriptions. I think that's the descriptions that people come up with. So what you've got there, though, is you've got specific frequencies operating, or specific frequency generators happening somewhere in the brain that form this pattern that then we give names to. I mean, that would be the answer that I don't have any more.
But I mean, they didn't tamper with it. They didn't say, "Oh, let's filter this frequency down." So, because the rest of it looks like a body, so why don't we just filter this down and make this part look like a head, and then we have a recognizable pattern. So you're saying that it just happened that way?
I think it's empirical evidence, and it's part of a you know, if you mapped it to the fast Fourier transform, you would get a different stretch in something that was coming up. You would get a different series of patterns that would shape. It would be much more elongated, because you would, and so yeah, I mean, I think it's just empirical. It's an empirical pattern that comes up, and then there's a name given to it.
So define empirical. That just means expression?
Yeah, so well, empirical means like we have the color red, which is it's defined as a particular sort of pattern of activity, light activity, series of an electrical signal, a light signal. So it's a specific frequency. So it's empirical data. It could be called something else, but it's basically, that's what we measure it as. That's the frequency range red exists in. And it's empirical what the human eye sees, even though there might be a spread in what everybody sees. Some people might see something more than other people. So it's empirical, the frequencies that we hear in our ears. You measure it, you give it units. And then that becomes the definition that we talk about. Somebody's measured it and given it units, so that becomes the empirical nature of it. See, it's the base level investigation, if you like, or the base. It's not. It's. I don't think it's, in a sense, discussable. It hasn't got a lot of interpretation to it.
It just is what it is.
It is what it is, and that becomes what we teach everybody to be able to have the greater discussions about it.
Very cool.
Deborah's got a...
Yeah, I would just add, empirical is limited by your measurement instruments. So whatever it is, it's doing the observing, the registering, and the measurement, that's your empirical data. So it is relative, and it's limited by whatever your paradigm is at the particular time.
So it is something that's measurable, which has value to it, but you've got to realize that it's
in a context. Yes.
It's in a context. And really, I mean, this comes up also with the mind mirror, that you have a particular set of empirical patterns that you see, but you're often putting people through a process to get to those patterns. So you're asking them to go down, to be quiet, to do something, to go through a process to be able to come up with it. Now, you couldn't necessarily say the reverse is true, necessarily say it. It can be true at times that if you look at a series of patterns, you can't necessarily say this is exactly what somebody's doing. You could say it's likely that they are doing that, but you would have to test people through a whole series of other processes that goes on to see if they come up with the same patterns. But it is true that certain meditations can have a pattern that you can pick up from on the mind mirror. So in the context that somebody has a meditation sequence, you know, you can characterize those meditations, and then it becomes empirical.
I have a question about maybe you know from what Max has said, maybe Judith also knows, but I'm looking at shamatha meditation, concentrative meditation. And you go through various phases till you come to what are called jhanas. And what I'm looking at, sort of thinking in my mind, I haven't looked at enough people who are really practicing this. In fact, this type of meditation is very understudied in the laboratory or university or wherever. But what I'm thinking is that the awakened mind pattern itself is what they refer to as the access meditation that you go through in order to get into the jhanas. But the jhanas themselves, I believe, are closer to what we call the evolved mind, or what we like to call the bliss ball. Because when people go into this evolved mind pattern, they begin to experience joy, bliss, happiness, you know, sort of these deeper emotions. And of course, in the jhana meditations, you go to a point where you are completely cut off from all external input, from all sensory input. So you're completely internal. So it's difficult to see. At a certain point, you're not getting any kind of feedback. So you have to kind of monitor them. But I'm just wondering if Max or maybe Judith has seen somebody doing these intense concentrative meditations where you begin to see the emergence of, and I'm thinking about the Tibetans in particular, because this is a type of meditation that they do. They see this pattern developing, the awakened mind pattern, and evolving into what we call the evolved mind pattern. So I'm just kind of throwing that out as a general question. I don't know exactly. It's sort of speculation at the moment on my part, is that that's what we're looking at, or where we might be going with people who are doing intense concentrated meditations.
Yeah, I don't know.
So yeah.
I think it's probably outside of the scope of this more technical mind mirror discussion, but I can say that I measured a bunch of Shambhala Buddhist monks, not monks, just practitioners, and they had these stages. Like first they would learn focus, and then their second stage was compassion, and then their third stage was this like bringing to mind these masters, and the focus got them to Gamma. and then the compassion got them to gamma, and then when they could see the ascended masters. I mean, they saw them in the sense that they would, with their awareness, put their minds on the color of the master's hair and every single tendril of hair. So the focused awareness, I mean, that is certainly associated with the gamma, but in all the scientific literature. But so I don't know about where the stillness would go in there, other than that the more you focus your awareness on one thing, you know, at some point it just gives way and you go into stillness. But the route to that does create some gamma at 40 hertz and above. But
did you happen to see whether or not there is an awakened mind pattern associated?
Oh yeah, that was child's play for them. Yeah. Child's play. When they were focusing, they had an awakened mind. With eyes open, I might say. They didn't have to close their eyes to get all that alpha. They've been staring at candle flames and things like that for years, you know, practicing that intense focus. So they were training the opposite way from us.
And, you know, and just to sort of, you know, reflect on the early days as well, with more limited equipment, like the bigger Mind Mirror 2s and stuff, you had this going on where people could do some of these exercises, and they would do something on the Mind Mirror that no Westerner had ever been able to see. So, you know, what is stilling the mind? I mean, just to be able to show that some beta disappears, you know, or the beta disappears, and yet when you have somebody else, when you try to do it yourself, it takes a long time to be able to do that. So that's where the empirical side comes in, that we've got something called beta, and we relate it to the monkey mind, and suddenly somebody comes along you can see them actually doing something that disappears and stuff. And it's like, well, this is a real empirical, again, it's then a map. I mean, it's a very simple map to say somebody's managed to squelched beta or come up with something else, be more positive with it for some time, you know, or some other pattern that comes in. And of course, you know, also the other side of it is that the holding those patterns, you know, if you can hold the pattern for a lot longer, it's somehow there's a deepening there. But the empirical nature of the, you know, we're good, our civilizations or our thinking is good at trying to pull these things apart, and of course then you have to put it back together as what's the experience on top of it and stuff. So
hey Neil, can you tell us something about those Tibetans, like what that was like? Where did y'all find those Tibetans? Did they just show up? Did they come from Tibet, or were they hanging around London? Would you put an ad in the paper, Tibetan monks who want to get on the Mind Mirror show up at such and such time? Were you around when that was happening? What were those guys like? What was going on there?
Well, so starting in 1959, there was a lot more people coming because of the Chinese invasion of Tibet. So there's a lot more people coming out of Tibet. And I know my wife's father was also in India at the time, and people were coming out of Tibet and looking for help, you know, so very diverse. I mean, Tibetans are a very diverse, the Tibetan lamas from all sorts of different traditions, and they were seeing that they needed to travel. And so suddenly their traditions that maybe had been secret or were only taught, this is me conjecturing, only taught to certain groups of people, they needed to get out there and develop a new clientele, new people. They needed to pass on this teaching to other people. So I think that was happening, was basically they were sort of, they were going into the outside world because they couldn't remain where they were. And then they were trying to they were open to talking about it. And anybody who could understand the language, I mean, that's the big problem, is that most people couldn't understand what was being talked about. So I guess they developed stories, and the Dalai Lama has, you know, pushed people into certain directions or encouraged certain things. He's the most visible, encouraged certain groups to start being measured in different ways, or to go through the programs to demonstrate that there was connections with the Western modes of science. So I wasn't directly involved in that, other than getting to meet some of the people around London and also hear about it at the time. but it wasn't a very long period that I was there. But you know, I heard from Geoff on some of the different people they were meeting, and of course the big interesting thing was, well, this is not the same as our Western model. You know, this is breaking that mechanistic. You know, the mechanistic model is very powerful to a point. It's powerful for billiard balls. It's powerful for the universe. Not very powerful for diverse human consciousness.
Were they just like as gentle as lambs, the ones you met?
I mean, they had a perspective and stuff. You know, I don't know whether gentle as lambs. You know, they did things at times where you know sort of hear about the chod, where the different types of trainings where you would go outside and cover in winter and cover yourself with a wet blanket, and then you would dry it out. So I mean, that's sort of it's an aggressive heat from inside, but as personalities and stuff, I mean, even Max was very, you know, was very personable and a person, but he offered to let me punch him in the stomach at one point because he'd had a black belt training, you know, and I was like, well, that's a very kind offer. I don't really want to belt my senior or my, you know, somebody in the stomach just because they offered. I mean, I didn't really want to prove that point, but he had a black belt training. And so there was also other trainings that were in there that weren't just the you know, what we might think of as the gentle perspective. But I think when people were being measured, that was certainly what they were. That was the aspect they were giving.
I ask that silly question because it's always struck me that it's a little ironic that you know, their sort of demeanor is, oh, but yet they're so incredibly interested in the science. You know, it's like a wonderful integration of a right brain kind of demeanor and a left brain. Because they get so lucid from all that training, and once they've got that gamma, then they want to know things. So I just was bringing that up because I think it's so interesting that it was Tibetans, but it was also Indians too, wasn't it? People from India.
So there was, I mean, I think it was all the different people who were coming through. So Geoff had a lot of contacts with Maharishi in Switzerland, who I think introduced a lot of people to different types of meditations. And Maharishi was even talking about a custom instrument. But there was other cultural overtones, I think, to that weren't so attractive for Geoff. So he didn't pursue that and things. But I think the swamis that were more emerging out of the long tradition in India of teaching spirituality and making a connection with followers wasn't as visible. But you know, you talk about the inquiry, and I was actually just going out to lunch with somebody who was from India yesterday, just somebody local here, and part of his discussion is just what was the industrialization? Why didn't India pick up on the industrialization? Why didn't India ask these questions? And it wasn't a value judgment, but it was, you know, India had a lot of interest, has a lot of interest in the internal technologies, and has never picked up on, as a large group of people, has never picked up on what we did in the West with what we call the Industrial Revolution, and of course making all the armaments that go with that. So what their cultural crucible was, you know, I'm not too sure, but this is, I mean, what Geoff and Max were working on was what was going on. What was the fact that we didn't know? It was following the scientific method, a scientific inquiry. Max had this long history of working with the human body, working with aspects of it. This depth of training with the Japanese Zen master, or that was a Bodh Gaya, that was in London in the early 40s. So he had this depth of interest himself, and at the end of when he retired, he was going to this next level of you know, observation and sharing what he knew and training people. And I, you know, really appreciated some of that very, you know, those classes that were very simple, and those meditations where you go inside a tree and really, you know, walk down into your unconscious in some forms, some of which is measurable and most of it which isn't. So I've got a couple of other little images that I picked up to leave you with. In a lot of my technical experience and a lot of, you know, engineering technical and even on the physics side is working with energy and with waves and just what is waves. And it's a very deep process in the technical side, whether or not we use them for the internet or whether or not we use them in this case for analyzing. So I've been, you know, very much immersed in what is it that's coming off the brain, and then how do you transform it, how accurate it is, and in trying to come up with that sort of, you know, what does that mean to, how can you put it in English? I'm just going to try this. So you should have, we're back to the 5 Hertz chirp and the FFT output. And now I've got a picture of waves. So you've got the picture of sea waves. And this is in a way what you can think of what's coming off the mind, off the brain. Again, differentiate between the mind, something, the brain. This is what somehow we're looking at from the brain and stuff. And then we're using instruments to, and I've just picked up some of these. This is what the hydrologists or the oceanologists, this is what they give the names of their waves. So this is obviously water height and the way it varies, but it's coming from somewhere. It's coming from the deep ocean, you know, so we're just picking up on the surface of it. You've got these, you know, airy waves, and then you've got something like solitary wave. You know, you've got something that comes up, and the empirical side is noting it and then trying to put a story behind it, a pattern and stuff. And in a way, this picture of the mind mirror is showing what the individual filters are doing. What they're doing is picking up on the shape of the wave. They're picking up on the electrical activity within the wave, and then they're giving it the names, the 38 hertz, the 15 hertz and stuff. So it's just an analogy. So it's not really what's going on, but it's a sort of an idea of what could be going on and how you look at brain waves, EEG, and then we get a picture on the screen and stuff. So then it comes up to this. So that's the end of my technical overview of you know, going from the measured EEG, the measured what's happening on the skull, which it's getting through all the blood and the bone, and we're picking up on these tiny electrical signals that are in the millionths of a volt. And you think that normally what's going on with our light bulbs is hundreds of volts. So we're you know, microvolts that we're picking up on the brain, very, very small. And then we're looking at these frequencies that come out of it and putting them like those waves, putting them into categories. And those categories are the Cade Blundell filters. So the Cade Blundell filters are the definition of what these categories are. If you use another transform of any sort, there's likely to be a different type of picture that evolves. You know, essentially in the analysis that I think you're doing, Judith and Oksana and everybody else, you're looking at the way these pictures vary across time, because that's what we can analyze, the human brain can analyze. If you switch it to an FFT transform, a different set of way of doing it, then you get a different transform that's happening. Some things may show up better, some things may disappear altogether, like under, you know, 8 hertz and stuff may disappear and stuff. But so that's my sort of my bit. So thank you very much for listening. My passion.
I love it, Neil. Thank you so much for making this understandable. But I wonder if you would talk more about how you and Geoff, or you alone, developed the Mind Mirror 3, because that was quite a leap to go from the diodes to that picture we just saw of the Mind Mirror 3. And you did some very clever things in there. Gary referred to this. In that Mind Mirror 3, you could actually set it up to play tones for various categories, and when we engineered the Mind Mirror 6 with Steve Clark, I mean, he picked up all the features that you had in the Mind Mirror 3. You could have the pattern outline, or you could have the bars in the outline, and those were really very far-sighted features. So can you just talk a little bit about that, how you made that technological leap?
Right. So bandpass filters have been understood since, let's say, the 1900s, because bandpass filters is what was used to pick up on radio waves, how to actually filter out. You've got a station on the radio. You want to listen to just one particular narrow bandwidth on the radio. So the basic filter characteristics are well understood. Geoff came up with those, and he was like, he got a very unique filter design that gave him a good response and was what we call stable. So it worked all the time, in other words, worked all the time in the conditions of the classroom. So he had characterized it, spent a lot of work on it and stuff. I was the new and up and coming, next generation guy that was coming through and stuff. Oh yeah, interesting, those bandpass filters. Bit of hard work to make them all work, isn't it? And while browsing a bookstore, a technical bookstore, actually in Palo Alto, I've been thinking about those filters and just how much work went into making them, manufacturing them and stuff. And there was things that could go wrong with it and stuff. And so I was looking at that, and I was involved in the tech industry and the internet type of thing, the telecom. And while browsing in a Palo Alto bookshop, there was a book that described how to make bandpass filters in software. So I looked at that, and at the time I had some various ups and downs that went on in the industry I was part of. So I ended up doing some sort of giving it all up and traveling around the world for a bit, get my education, see some places and things, and then you travel around the world, fascinating everything, but you relate to what your conditioning is. And I was sitting on a beach in Bali, and I suddenly had an epiphany of, well, this is how I could put it all together. And, so it was sort of like, well, interesting, but I got back to, at that time, England, and I was doing somewhere, went in and said hello to Geoff as well and all the travels. Then I went back to where I was staying and got out my computer, and I did what I call prototyping that signal. I said, okay, well, here's all the maths, and the maths I really couldn't understand. The maths that's in there of how it works. It was like you do a whole bunch of stuff to it, and so I prototyped all that. I did what these instructions, what the mathematicians had said to do, and then I put in some of the pure frequencies, like I said, the sine waves, and sure enough, the outputs came out. So that was sort of those, the theoretical view of what would become the Mind Mirror. So I went back to Geoff, and I sort of said, Geoff was thinking about the FFTs at the time because there were chips. So Geoff was an analog engineer, didn't do anything in the software side because that was a different type of expertise and stuff, but he built things. He had his business in radio microphones. There are a lot of filters in the radio microphones and things. And I sort of said, well, so, FFTs, but what do you think about doing the bandpass filters and software? And he sort of said, well, that'd be ridiculous. I don't believe you. And I sort of said, well, I think I can do it. Mm-hmm. Well, I guess if you want to waste your time on it, and I said, well, this is what I'll need to do it. I'll need to be able to, what if I do it, can I use the resources? I wasn't working for him at all. But, can I use the company and do the stuff like that? And then one of his other partners also, that was one of the other partners in the company, did some of the design for the Mind Mirror 3, the faceplate and stuff, and got the colors and things like that. So basically, I prototyped it and did it and then showed him and was like, my God, it works. And then later on he says, well, I was just testing you, I was just motivating you by saying I don't believe it, But, there's the change in technologies and stuff, that I didn't really believe it either, but I could prototype it and I could prove that it works and stuff. So I could prove that it works. And then it becomes much more widespread, so the bandpass filters fit into a particular category of mathematics called digital signal processing. And that's used a lot in the audio like we're doing right now. So there's a lot of computing power going into all our different screens being transmitted around the world. So the computers really evolved to do what we're doing right now. And a lot of, computing power has gone into doing that digital signal processing. And the processing for the bandpass filters is much less of a requirement now. But when I did it in the 1990 is when I did it, I had to be very specific about picking out the technology that could run on those particular computers, or the specific processor, because that was a custom processor that I used.
Well, you saved its life. You saved the life of the mind mirror, because it couldn't have continued to exist in diode form. You bridged it from the past to the future. Right.
So I brought it into the digital age.
You did.
Is what it did, and and gave it that boost, and then so I did it. So I mean, this is a tradition, isn't it? There's Geoff and Max did some work. I mean, Joe Camille, if you like, was doing something with Zen monks and measuring it with some instruments at the time. Max picked up on it, and Geoff picked up on it. They did it a broader spectrum. I was able to help with I was able to do something for a period of number of years, and then Anna picked up with working with Thought Technologies, I think, and I helped Thought Technologies characterize that. So I became be able to hold the technical tradition of what was going on, so it didn't do too much, didn't drift off too much, didn't do something different. And then working with Vilistus as well, he's picked up on it and really done a lot of the miniaturization and brought the costs way down from where it used to be, to produce the current instruments, and added more to it. So I mean, that's tradition. I think a mind mirror tradition.
Has Joe Camille had a chance to see the new Vilistus?
No, we haven't.
We have a friend who's a very close sort of family friend of Joe Camille's, and she's spoken to him about this, and he was very interested in seeing the Vilistus, and we've been sort of negotiating. This friend of ours hasn't really moved forward on that. She suggested that we go see Joe because Joe was interested. So I'm hoping, that maybe in the next few months or weeks we'll be able to get together with Joe on this.
Where does Joe live? Where is he?
He's in San Francisco.
He is San Francisco. That's what I thought. Because I saw him maybe, 10, 15 years ago. And some of his talk, his basic thing was to talk about, he had something like scientists often do. He had a particular breakthrough, and that's what he talked about, yes, I think, through most of his career. So there's other aspect of what he did in measuring Zen monks that we then relate to. I don't think that was the mainline part of what he did. And he certainly, I don't know whether, on some of these things, when you have a secret tradition, like I think the mind mirror technology still is, or some of the teaching on this doesn't fit into the mainstream category of things. I think it's somewhat still secret.
We're very
esoteric. So it has its particular tradition. And like with many of these things, they can happen for 100 years before somebody within the mainstream picks up on it and validates it in a different way.
No,
that's the lucky thing. That's the lucky thing, is that we connected up with Vilistus, and that you worked with Vilistus, and we got it onto a neurofeedback machine. That's a quantum leap because of the data analysis, and now researchers are interested in it, and it's just a whole different world. But if I can circle back for a moment to applauding you and thanking you for saving the mind mirror's life by bringing it into the 20th and now the 21st century, I think it's really interesting that you had your eureka insight on a Bali beach, where the left brain studies you had done. Now we were talking about the Tibetan monks being all soft and gentle on the right and being interested in the intellect. It's just a follow-up of everything we do, is that you get on the beach and the right brain says, oh, I see. Oh, I understand what to do. You had your eureka there. And it's without that eureka, without all the life circumstances that put you on that journey because things weren't working right there. Just think. I don't know that this mind mirror would ever, because Geoff was still alive. That was the key, is that you could then take it to Geoff and say, what have we got? We've got it. By George, I think we've got it.
Well, exactly. And, you know, and then he could validate it and he could teach about it. And you know, Max, well, you know, Anna particular was the person who picked up on it at the time, and she could see that it would take it forward and taught with it and stuff. And it, you know, it was the move forward, and we learned certain things as well in the display. The old Mind Mirror 2s were friendly in their lights, especially in a darkened classroom, whereas more of the early digital technology wasn't as easy, and you needed a bigger computer and various things, you know, the big computers of the day to display them and stuff. So it wasn't quite as photogenic. But then it was, you know, the next stage was able to the computer form made it easier to be able to display and to take it to Esalen and to be able to do other things on it. But the core of it was the meditation, and people's process was supported.
Yes, again, the subjective objective match.
And then you picked up on it as well. So, you know, that's absolutely amazing where you've taken it.
Yeah.
And gone forward, and other people as well in the training and things. So,
well, serendipity again. I mean, I had somebody come from India who had one and said, you know, because the thought technology, I mean, it was just so undeveloped. It had the frequencies on the sides of the mind mirror. So I had to leave the pattern to see what the band. So I got them to clean up some stuff like that, but it was just so slow. You couldn't, the user controls were terrible. This guy comes from India and says, well, I think this is going to be able to hook up 4 people at a time. And I go, and the GSR. And I go, you mean we could take the ESR to the GSR? I mean, he just brought it here. And it's more of that serendipity. I mean, the mind mirror has a destiny. It has a life of its own. It has an energy and thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
In that flow of energy and saving its life back then, bringing it forward. Now, so I imagine that we've still got some people here who have questions. Why don't I get out of the way?
I'd like to pose a question there. Since you mentioned the GSR, ESR, we had this brief talk last time we met, Judy, and I know that the actual measure that is being done there with the Vilistus is based on GSR, and I always understood that they're really very different beasts, if you will allow me, because the ESR is giving you a reading of the parasympathetic, and the GSR is reading the sympathetic autonomic nervous system. So did you actually, I from what I recall from our conversation, correct me if I'm wrong, but you also, do you remember what the conclusion was there? Because I am, it's quite faint there for me, but was this reading checked over the ESR, the actual ESR reading? Because, you know, it looks like not a relative, but an absolute reading. And you remember that on the ESR, it's a different reading when you get the absolute and the relative, and you train over the relative and not the absolute.
Right. Yeah. So I'll just be brief because we want to let people ask Neil questions. But essentially, the GSR that Vilistus had was not as sensitive as it needed to be able for the ESR to be calibrated into it. So they actually had to create a new GSR, much more sensitive one. And the GSR they have can function as an ESR and measure ohms, or it can function as skin conductance and sweat gland sympathetic activity and measure eusemins. And so I sent Steve Clark an ESR, and he went over and visited Peter Staples, who had manufactured, after Geoff Blundell's time, was manufacturing the ESRs. And so they worked out how to calibrate it to get the Lesch scale. So yes, the meter that was the ESR has got the relative scale, that central one. So we're just now seeing it go up and down rather than see a needle drop from the left to the right. And when we press the basal button to get the Lesch scale, the reading on the Lesch scale, now that is the Lesch scale that we have a specific window for, and it is operating in ohms, just as the ESR did.
But you remember from our conversation that kept in my mind, you know, the reading. My question there was if that reading was the absolute, which is still ohms, or the relative, and
it's both. We got both windows. We're monitoring both in separate windows.
Right. Yeah.
But as far as the physiology, let us take up this question if we might, but I bet you Deborah Suich can tell us more about the physiology than I can, for sure. And I don't know if Neil knows the physiology as well.
I don't, but I mean, I understood that, I'm just looking it up. I mean, ohms, the inverse of ohms is mhos, I think. And I think Siemens is also that unit of conductance. So electrical conductance is just the reverse, the inverse of electrical resistance.
Mm-hmm.
So I think they both relate to the autonomic nervous system, to the parasympathetic. They're both a measurement, I think. So I'm dangerous on this, but that's my understanding, is that they both relate to that. But
they both
worked in biofeedback in the U.S. We use mhos, micro ohms. So that's characteristic of the measurements in all of the ESR in the U.S. The British, for some reason, use ohms. The GSR used to be an old measurement that we used back in the 90s or even the 80s, and that eventually evolved. And even in the 90s, we were still using mhos or simians. So that, I guess that had to be a shift, because when we worked with Anna, she was using GSR and they were measuring in ohms because it came from England. So I guess Steve kind of corrected for all of that.
Yeah.
So you could probably choose what you want now, because it's
Exactly.
in software, and they are a direct relationship, an inverse relationship to each other. So one is a different set of, it's just a different scale.
Exactly. You can choose either one. But if you choose the ohms, then it ends up that that the relaxation is a rising line, which is sort of counterintuitive, and arousal is a descending line. So that's why we're using the skin conductance, so that arousal is going up and relaxation's going down. I would be curious to see if anyone else has any questions for Neil about the Mind Mirror 3, any of those things we were talking about earlier, and wants to pick up on them. I bet you, Deborah, you have a question.
Yeah, I have a couple of points to make. The GSR and the electrical skin resistance, ESR, they are both opposite ends of the autonomic nervous system. You're correct. So I don't know how they balance that, because it would be ideal to be able to see both sides of the autonomic nervous system presented to you, and that's what you get with heart rate variability. Actually shows you the two sides of the autonomic nervous system because of the way the heart works. And so that would be ideal. And since And I do believe the reason we have the heart rate variability is to sort of get at that aspect of it, to bring the two sides or the two halves of the autonomic nervous system together and be able to visualize that activity and how balanced it is. So it's really the combination of all of these sensors that gives you a more complete pattern or picture, well, of not only, you know, really of the central nervous system and the two branches of the nervous system, how they're working together as, in fact, the brain, the two halves of the two hemispheres are working together. And it's having all of these sensors or all of these inputs that allows you a more complete picture of what's going on, you know, in reference to both body and brain and their integration, as well as the integration of the two hemispheres. That's how I see it. And if you want, then you can build the biofeedback strategies to optimize both of those states and to integrate them. Going back to, we had the conversation about the Buddhist monks and why they're so interested in the mind. That is, in fact, a central tenet of the Buddhist tradition, is studying the mind and how it works, how it functions, and how it can optimally function in this plane and perhaps integrate into other dimensions and other planes of existence and consciousness. Okay, so now we go back to the mind mirror, and my question is, and I came late, I am sorry, I wanted to ask, going back, why we ended up with alpha placements, you know, alpha placements, occipital and parietal. And I think I came in on the tail end of that, that the reason behind that was, in fact, that it was taken from the Buddhist tradition and the monks, and the fact that they visualize when they meditate, and that was why that became the placements of choice, or the placement of choice. Is that right?
Well, roughly right, that it's the visualization, but the visual, as I understand it from Max in the discussion, okay, is that as humans, our visualization is very much part of our, tied into our autonomic nervous system.
Okay.
So, you know, you've got, we are activated by some of our visions and stuff. And you've got the internal vision side. So does that meditation, when you are doing your Lesh, when you're looking at the Lesh states, I'm not too sure that it, I mean, the discussion was with the physiologists, where are these things happening? You know, so in those days, what they're doing, you know, I don't know that they exactly knew what was going on, but there was some models and some leaps, some guesses to actually see it. So the occipital cortex, and remember, the mind mirror is measuring laterally across the occipital cortex. So we're taking two parts and measuring laterally there. The traditional measurement that's somewhere is usually to take, let's say, this point, and you measure it somewhere in the middle of the head. So it's measuring the 2 points across that occipital cortex, what is measurable on the skull, between wherever you make that placement, but it's primarily on the occipital cortex that's there. And the reasoning that I heard was it was this visualization. It was where we process our views, and that as humans, we are our view really dominates our processing. So dogs are much more sort of smell and stuff. So there would be other animals elsewhere. But I mean, it's also fairly easy to place something on those areas. And in a lot of this type of investigation, I mean, especially in the early days when you're doing something, it's got to work. If you're measuring something deep inside the brain and you haven't got an MRI to do it, you know, you can't really investigate there. You can talk about some of that, you know, where you think things are happening, but it becomes a human model. So that was Max's choice, I believe.
And I think he got that from Joe Camilla, because that was the alpha generator. That's where alpha is maximally generated, and he wanted to start from that basic framework, I think, of what we knew at the time, and, you know, how we were studying consciousness. And it was all around the alpha rhythm, and then going, of course, to theta, and then delta, and yes, okay, beta and gamma. But now I have an understanding of where this came from. And my thinking now, though, taking the Vilistus forward and the mind mirror forward, I think we need to broaden that a little bit. Yeah, we're very visual, but we're realizing we're also very auditory. Humans are very auditory. And, you know, the auditory system sort of got lost in the shuffle, but is now becoming a real focus of interest in research. So, again, and I'm thinking of it from a more mass dissemination standpoint, trying to put, and we've had these conversations before many times.
Well, I think Anna used the word sensualization. You know, so I think it went from that visualization, which was dominant, and then Anna sort of with some of the stuff said, well, actually all the senses work for different people in different ways. And so, you know, if you're in meditation and you smell a lot, you know, or something comes out with you, then that is valuable. But, you know, I think that question that you ask is, I mean, it's the Max tradition was at the back. And there's work based on that. But if you can shift it to somewhere else, because, I mean, we did come up with a prototype 4-channel mind mirror at one point, and it was just it just didn't work. I mean, we weren't able to take it forward in terms of everything. We had inside the actual mind mirror, we came up with 4 channels to be able, instead of 2 channels, to be able to measure in different places, but it just didn't get out there. Wasn't able to make it and do get the software out, they get the screen displays and stuff like that. So, you know, now it's a case of, I think, if you can get it to another part of the brain, either move those electrodes to somewhere else, because there's no reason why you can't put them elsewhere, but now you have to justify it based on the research, and does it give you some extra value? And, you know, I'm out of my depth.
No, and those pictures, the awakened mind, the evolved mind, they're very specific to those placements.
Well, but not exclusive.
Okay.
So the way I see the mind mirror moving forward is if we're going to get top of the mind recognition about the mind mirror so that it can get out to the masses, it's going to have to happen with a frontal hookup where somebody's not going through hair. So for the past 2 years, I have been sending around a dual setup so that you make the 4, the temporals and the occipitals, and then you have a separate ground wire so that you're able to use an internal ground simultaneously on the forehead. So Steve designed a special rig for me, and so I've been circulating that thing. Unfortunately, everybody I send it to keeps it for several months, so it's been really slow trying to get it. Gary just sent it out to Gary and Phyllis in Riverside, California. It's going to James Ripley next. I can send it to you if you want it next, Deborah. But essentially, so the idea was that, so we've got 2 windows we're looking at simultaneously on the computer screen, and one is projecting the back of the head and one's projecting the front. And so I had it like up here in the Northeast circulating for a while, and 3 different people did it, and some people couldn't figure out the hookup and didn't get it right. But I have a sheet of paper that everybody reports their pattern goes in there, and of course we have the recorded sessions, and it looks like the same pattern. It's very, very similar on the frontals, and the beta is a little bit bigger, the alpha is way smaller with the eyes closed, and with the eyes open it's even bigger, which is the exact opposite when you're measuring in the back. But there's something about attenuation and where alpha's rising up from the brain. Leonardo would know more about that.
Yeah, I just make a comment there, is that alpha is and theta in the frontals are directly related to, especially theta, but alpha too. And there is a question regarding synchronization and CFCs, which is cross-frequency coupling that is going on there with the networks and everything. So you would expect that when Neil was talking about this, or was it you about concentration, when you actually concentrate, and there the awakened mind pattern shows up, and exactly, it makes a lot of sense, because you're dealing with the frontal parietal network, which is related with the midline structures that relate to the self and everything. This is all working in synchrony for you to have the attentional process that is being engaged in meditation.
Yeah, well, here's the cool thing about it, is that one practitioner, when I came up with this idea of the frontal thing, one practitioner said, well, is it as dynamic on the frontals? And it is. So I was shifting states. I can produce a diamond pattern. I can produce an awakened mind pattern with evolved mind bottom. I haven't produced an evolved mind because I'm too busy wondering what the pattern's looking like to really get to the infinite, while I'm doing it. But it looks like it's dynamic on the front too.
But I'd like to tell you something about. I just did this reading this week, and it was amazing. I have this client of mine, which is she went into deep meditation previously before coming to me, and she entered into some very deep stuff, and I think she really she went beyond what she was expecting. But the thing is, she lives in a meditative state. She struggles not to be into it. And what you get from a full, I work with 19 channel cap reading, and what you get is the temporal and occipital areas firing up like hell. Everything else is normal, but the temporal occipital area. This is why when we started this conversation with Neil, I was very curious about this selection. If they ever had measured something that justified keeping the sensors on the back of the head, but reading from everywhere, what you get is exactly those placements. So
Whoa.
that I can send you this map, and you're gonna blow your head out.
Well, you're going to do a webinar for us. We're trying to. Did you finish writing your book so we can schedule the webinar? Because we want to talk about the mind mirror and brain networks. That's a big subject here.
I would like to take the opportunity that we have Neil online with us here, and maybe why can't we go further from not just 4 but the full cap readings, and nowadays you can do Loretta live readings of the structures and select the networks to actually have a glimpse of what is happening there, and really research on when the person is you have the mind mirror reading it and the cap over it, and compare those readings with the networks, the different networks, and what they are doing. This is what I think, from humbly my perspective of where we should go. This is where we should go.
Yeah.
And it's cheap.
Well, one of the things though is to, as I said, was trying to, with the actual bandpass filters, is to see if you can get that profile on all the different points. I mean, because it's the baseline at the moment that everybody's used, is that particular configuration, the Cade Blundell network, the Cade Blundell sort of.
I've speculated on this in the past, is that the awakened mind pattern is a standing wave pattern. over the cortex, and that the underlying patterns, the other underlying frequencies shift from one area to another. However, we maintain, when we have an awakened mind pattern, we have that standing wave pattern that organizes all of the substructures, which shift back and forth. So we actually need to look at the overall pattern that's occurring, and there's particular math to do this. It's beyond anything I can do, but it would actually tell us whether or not that awakened mind pattern was a standing wave. And they've seen this in some of the meditations as well, that you get these standing wave patterns, and yet at the same time, the substructures in the brain are firing at different rates, moving around. So, this is something we need to look at as well.
Well, that's so I mean, that's where I think there are people who are trying to relate the electrical activity to the neurons, the billions of neurons that are resulting in this. That's a sort of like the question you're asking, I think. Where are those dominant groups coming from? By a standing wave, what are you sort of referring to? What are you thinking?
What I'm referring to is that, let's say you have alpha. It's not changing. But what area of the brain is actually producing the alpha? Where the alpha is being produced may be shifting from one area of the brain to another, from one subnetwork to another. And yet that pattern is still there. So it's a dynamic sort of generation of the alpha, but the alpha itself is a guiding wave pattern that is standing over the cortex, which is where we're measuring.
Right. So there would be at one level, there's a dominant frequency that's being measured, alpha, and at the moment it's coming from the occipital cortex. But if you measure it all over, is it as visible? Is it as measurable all over? And then, I mean, I know other instruments also look at the phase difference between them, and the coherence between the two different waves, and that may or may not be important from a consciousness point of view. I mean, I don't know. It's what is that you're looking at. So I think it's a that's where the people who are doing more investigation into the structures of the brain, when you've got alpha, what is it that's going on with the collections of neurons? Why are they getting this synchronization? I mean, this is just from more of a lay engineer's side. There
was another something maybe I can look it up again, that was very revealing to me, and that they were doing, I guess, Loretta or fMRI, I think at the same time. And what they were looking at was that they were doing a click, auditory click periodically, so they could see what was happening. And what you saw was that you have an auditory network, which you already mapped out, but there was a connectome that was not part of that network. So what you saw was that all of the frequencies, delta, theta, alpha, beta, all of the frequencies were there, and they were moving through the brain, through different areas, all at the same time, and being generated by this click. So that it wasn't, you just didn't hear it, you just didn't get it click, and there was some beta. All of the frequencies were there, all at the same time, and moving through these connectomes in the brain very rapidly within a matter.
But as I understand it, there are different connected layers that are happening. So you've got one layer that interprets all those frequencies and stuff, the click. Yep. But then what is the click that happens? And so what's unusual, I think, is that you do at in some circumstances, you get an alpha wave coming out of it. Why do you get an alpha wave? Why isn't it totally random all the time? Why aren't all the frequencies there all the time? Because from
alpha is synchronous stuff in the brain. Alpha and theta. When there is a beautiful paper on that that explains how alpha and theta and even delta, the lower frequencies, they create like the roads for the higher frequencies to run over. You know, so when areas start to communicate, they first enter into a coherent pattern in the lower frequencies, and then there is the higher frequencies that actually carry the information in between areas.
Yes,
And
yeah, exactly,
yes,
Leonardo. The theta generally carries the delta. I mean the gamma. So if you, I mean, gamma is specific to certain areas of the brain. It produces
right.
gamma. It doesn't spread.
Right.
It's what
Right.
spreads it is the theta is carrying that gamma wave and
Right.
spreading it over different areas of the brain at the same time.
Not
So
just
actually broke
not
down.
just Gary.
Yeah,
You have delta and you have alpha. There is a paper by Lee. I can share the paper with the group.
yes, please.
It's very technical, very very good, and he shows how different bandwidths, how different frequencies, they use different sets of lower frequencies. You know, there is they couple with each other. It's a symphony in the brain, really. It's very beautiful to see, and I'm using that for another kind of work, which is mixing neurofeedback with Z-scores and everything. But that's another area. This is this kind of coupling that is happening is what sets up the networks in the brain. And one another interesting piece of information that I wanted to share with you guys is that the salience network is guided by the insula, which is right in the temporal area, beneath the temporal area, and the right insula is the one that actually shifts, you know, these networks, who comes in to the play field, who comes out. So it's very interesting that this is also in the temporal area. So I think we have to deal with all this bunch of new information that is coming out from very advanced research nowadays, and which I'm studying too, and try to really make something out of this 19-channel, at least 19-channel full cap readings that give you that can give you enough information for what we are trying to figure out here. And just to close and not extend myself too much, I think we should have this mind mirror with the 19 channels, you know, doing the filters that Neil was talking about, and not FFT. The problem with these technologies that are available out there is all the 19 channels are all FFT, and we should be able to have the bandpass filters, the digital filters that Neil is talking about on 19 channels, and doing all these readings. It would be amazing.
There you go,
It would, Leonardo. But let me just say a couple things here about this. One is that Neil showed us that the elegance of the mind mirror in its ability to track changes in consciousness is because it's a two-channel and a dual hemisphere, and it shows the interrelationships of the frequency bars and the categories. Not only is our database built on that, but the thing is so organic, it's just freakily organic, where we see the gamma increase in amplitude when the theta increases in amplitude. I mean, we're seeing all of these theories of consciousness. It's just the mind mirror is so pure. You cannot. So we can't like infuse the mind mirror with any greater complexity.
What I was going to say is that using the 19 channels is a way of simply validating to the wider community the function and the viability of the mind mirror, so that they can understand what's going on.
I mean, so I think, I mean, some of those questions have always been asked. Just, it's a question of, you know, at some level, who can do the effort to be able to do some of that measurement? So if there is an instrument where it can be crafted to do the, you know, the mind mirror bandpass filters per channel, then, you know, and, you know, part of it is then you have to test it all. So what's not very visible at times is that, gee, you make something new, but now you've got to characterize it and make sure that it actually behaves that way. And there isn't some software bug in there, or isn't there some glitch that happens and stuff, so that you can believe the readings there. So, you know, if there's a package that takes those 19 channels, or even can record them to disk, which is standard and stuff, and then do the transform on them, a bandpass transform on them to be able to do some correspondence. I mean, it's all doable from a science point of view. Just who's got the effort, who's got...
I've had a request from Joe Dispenza's group, which didn't come through very well because of, I don't know what was going on in the background. But the request from actually Joe, which I spoke to him, was to take the raw data off of some of his monitors and run it through the mind mirror, and to see what sort of patterns were showing up in some of his data, which looks very bizarre, and I'm not quite sure what it is they're reading. So I talked to Steve about that, and he said, sure, send me the raw data and we can do this. But you know, I never got the raw data from Dispenza. Even though I requested it repeatedly, and they said they would provide it, they never did.
Well, so just as a, you know, those bandpass filters which I put up, they're pretty standard. And if somebody could get in some of these departments a grad student, you know, make some linkages. We're across the industry is a lot about these research institutes are a lot about the linkages. They should be able to take that data on a computer and just run it through the filters and see what the outputs come out like. But, you know, one of the things I always suggest people do when looking at something new like this is to, in a sense, prototype it and say, if you took 19 filter outputs and you generate another 15 sets of data out of that, what is the way that you're going to be able to compare them? How do you visualize it? You
can have software. Sorry.
I'm sorry, I'm losing you.
Yeah, you're breaking up a lot, Leonardo. I was going to say Dispenza's data is not very good because he takes it at these workshops and he hooks people up on an assembly line one after another with no standardizing of the way that he's hooking people up or taking any sort of neuropsychological profile of what's happening to them. And so, you know, trying to put that data into any kind of database and analyze it, I don't know how meaningful it would be.
Well, I mean, we don't have to wonder. I mean, we already know how to do it. We just prepare a questionnaire, have the people that we're hooking up fill out the questionnaire, do an eyes open and eyes closed baseline, and then put in markers, and then let him lead his meditation, and we get a mind mirror summary and we see what's happening. I think it would be less useful to us to take his data than to just hook people up. Are you hooking people up, you and Donna, at his workshop in Paris in May?
In May, probably.
Okay, well, so I volunteer, and so has Suzanne Temple coming in from Rotterdam. So that's 4 of us on at least 3 DSUs. I've got a 4th DSU. I mean, let's get our own data. And then we set it up as a controlled experiment with the opening and closing baselines and seeing what he's doing in the meanwhile. Neil, I take your point that if we have a 19 channel and, you know, we're trying to figure out what that looks like, in the mind mirror, I mean, Leonardo, I can see us as you said, hooking up 2 sets at the same time. Let's put the mind mirror electrodes on, because that is incredibly exciting to me. Because, so I was telling somebody today that we know that gamma is associated with whole brain synchrony, but I think the mind mirror is whole brain synchrony too, because of the flow of awareness through up and down those categories. The whole thing is about synchronization of the brain, where it's firing simultaneously. And what better way than for Leonardo with his 19 channel, or Jeffrey Martin with his 64 channel. Let's get in there and produce some mind mirror patterns with or without the thing on. I mean, I don't need the thing. I can just make the pattern, but for the sake of proof and for control, to have them both on at the same time. And then, then we have some proof that the awakened mind is not just us saying it's a flow of consciousness, and the many, many thousands of people who have been measured, them saying, yeah, there's a flow of consciousness. We're looking at it on a
when you have meditation, you have a flow of gamma from the frontals to the back when you have mindful meditation. When you have awakened mind meditation, it flows back into the frontals. So this is very interesting too.
That is interesting.
May I just ask a question? Has anybody done both of them? Leonardo, have you done the 19 channel cap with the mind mirror?
Not yet. And we are talking.
All right. Now, has anybody done the 64 channel with the mind mirror?
I hope to do it when at this Trans Tech conference in
all right. So that we're speculating. This is all, you know, wonderful, but until you actually make these comparisons, you know, that's what we're doing. We're speculating. It may be perfectly accurate, but that's where I thought you were coming from, Leonardo. You had actually done the two of them together, but you haven't. All right. I thought that maybe the 64 channel, because you were at that conference last year, Judith, I guess you didn't get a chance, and I had heard that there was some movement afoot through his meditation. He was doing a course, and you were going to maybe combine them then. All right. So we don't have any of this data yet. Is that correct?
That's right, but we're right smack on the verge of getting it.
So I just wanted to get that understanding up front. And then Gary, and about the standing wave, you know, all of this, I think that image that Neil put up, the ocean, is really, to me, a brilliant image of what we're looking at from a brain standpoint and how networks work dynamically. And that's really where we're going with this. How can we look at the brain in a very dynamic state? And that's really complex. And I think the smartphone and the technology advances that we are seeing are going to make that a reality in the future. But, you know, we're really speculating on something that isn't here yet. I mean, even when we test out the mind mirror, it's done in a very static environment. I mean, you know, it's not really an interactive environment. So all of this, I think that the platform we have is really a phenomenal platform to take forward, but it's still in an early stage. And from my standpoint, I'm just looking at it to be maximally disseminatable. And if you're putting electrodes in the back of your head and walking around, that's not really going to disseminate. And it's not going to disseminate in a really interactive, dynamic state. So I think that all of this is preparation to try to get it to that point where one can look at it in a very dynamic environment. And going back to the monks, I mean, what they've achieved is amazing, but they're also human beings. And, you know, different sects used to burn down each other's temples on a very regular basis. So let's not, you know, divorce ourselves from reality here. It's also, how do we translate this, these awakened states and the evolved mind state, into our day-to-day lives and be compassionate human beings with one another. That's really where we need to take this, I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, you know, on the mountaintop, it's real easy to get into these meditative states. You're isolated. But when you're dealing with, you know, a sick child and just, you know, putting food on your table, how do you stay compassionate and human then? And that's where I think we really want to go with these technologies. So, all right, I didn't mean to give a monologue, but I have to run along.
Yes, we all do, but I appreciate what you say, Deborah. And, you know, honestly, this is why I'm up on this frontal hookup, because more people will have access to it, because it's so similar to the Awakened Mind pattern. So many people, more people can do it. And how do we become more passionate? Well, we get down into that theta where we're not in conflict and where we have access to wellspring of wisdom that can help us through our everyday lives. And thank you, Neil. I mean, I don't want to embarrass you or anything, but I think we've seen very clearly here that if you hadn't scooped the thing up and brought it into the 20th century, we wouldn't have it into the 21st century. Or do I have my centuries right? I don't know, but you know what I mean.
Yes, no, I appreciate it. Yeah, I mean, that's what I felt like I was doing, was just the tradition at the moment maybe isn't got connections with the rest of the culture. It's maturing. There was a couple of other incidents where people were using it that I really didn't feel very comfortable either in the way they were using it in our culture. You know, I feel that the way that everybody's using it is fantastic, and it's lovely to hear what people are doing. But I put in a couple of years to make it happen. It felt like I needed to do it, and it's nice to talk about it here, you know. So,
well, it's nice to finally be able to see a face with a name.
I know. Yeah.
Right. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Neil.
Well, good. Well, it's good to hear everybody and how they're using it, and you know, and I mean, I think there's just to sort of cap that to what was taken. There's the research side of things, of where the correlation happens, and really to set it up and how to do it. And then there is how can more people use it. And I just circulated a link that I found while I was trying to search out these visualizations on, you know, where you know, if it can be reduced to something that is very simple, that is simple to set up, you know, even though, as we know, some of these things may not be perfect, and it perhaps can be talked about where it's not so perfect, but if it's more accessible, it allows a different type of usage. So it's just to, you know, on the research side, it's one thing, but if there's something in there that is really useful, then, you know, we are into that, the quantified self, or quantifying, you know, the sleep patterns, quantifying our meditation patterns. I mean, for me personally, it sort of came up that meditation is about sitting and doing some of it. So the EEG is one aspect of that, helping everybody else to see it, and particularly helping other people who are not in that same tradition, not feeling they have to go over to the Buddhist tradition, but there is a very healthy response from some of these technologies. But it's, yeah, I mean, it's for everybody there. If you can get something going, that's the, you know, find a way of making it happen. Math lab, taking the recordings. I mean, I think that crucial thing there, if you've got the EEG with the two corresponding instruments, and most of the equipment will allow it to be recorded. Mm-hmm. So, you know, it's to capture, get a sample of I mean, this is the traditional scientific method of find somebody who is an ideal representation, shows up with a mind mirror in the way that you want it to do, and that captures another EEG, and then share it.
That's it.
Share the raw data.
We're going to have a webinar on this, just called the Frontal Awakened Mind, and do it pretty soon, because the truth is that if we take people into a personal transformation meditation online, and they're anything of a meditator, this is Anna's meditation, then they should be going into an awakened mind pattern. And it's a simple matter to put 5 electrodes on the frontal. So the whole webinar is going to be about, let's hook you up, everybody hook up. Let's see how similar your patterns are to one another. Let's look for anomalies. If there are anomalies, well, then we're not heading in the right direction. But I don't think they are. I think, as somebody said here, brainwaves resonate throughout the head with small differences on the frontals, and
for a dominant activity.
For a dominant activity of meditation.
If you're going inside, so I don't know, maybe actually in that.
I'm really concerned about the frontals and artifact.
Well, if you're in meditation, you're okay.
Well, not even there. I mean, if you just have your eyes closed and your eyes are moving underneath your closed eyelids, you're still picking up artifact. Any kind of jaw tension, muscle tension, eyelid, the eye, forehead tension at all is all being picked up as gamma or some other sort of artifact. And it's, unless you're really aware of that and filtering it, this is another reason why we use the occipitals, because we don't have that kind of issue with artifacts.
We have very good filters now at this point, Gary. We actually have pretty good filters.
Yeah.
So I think what you'd want to try and do is phrase exactly that question, because I mean, in one of Geoff's designs, he didn't have the EMG on there, and they brought in the EMG because they really needed to validate the rest of the signal in there. So, I mean, that may be, I don't know enough about the gamma side of things and stuff, but that may be when you're getting into the gamma, or even EMG up there, that you put some of those filters in there, which do cost a bit more on software. The processing power in software is higher on that, but should be possible to do it to have some sort of goodness indication. It's good, or there's something in there. On the back of the head, you can get overpowered, with the shoulders.
Yeah, that's right.
With some of that. So I think everybody has to be taught about that the muscles can overpower the signal in some way. But, if somebody is blinking, it's going to look like delta.
Yeah, you're going to see that, but just having, like I say, even with your eyes closed, if you have muscle tension in the eyes, that's going to be picked up as gamma, because muscle tension is all in gamma range.
It does, and it appears in delta, but the thing is, as you drop into theta, your eyes soften, and your visual processing becomes more knowing and sensing than actual physical eye movement. So that's one thing that helps, but it's also true that we're pretty heavily filtered, as Deborah pointed out. So, I mean, I've tested this thing with a dual setup and on myself many times, and it's you reach a point in meditation where you're not creating SEMG artifact, besides which we have the data windows. We can see how high the SEMG artifact is, but I think it'll work. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. I mean, the online Frontal Awakened Mind webinar that we have planned, this is where we're going to see how well it works and how it does in a wide-scale experiment, simultaneous wide-scale experiment. But I think it's ready to move forward into the masses if we can get that pattern. And that's right where we want it to go. That's where it deserves to go. Not enough people know what Neil has done. I mean, this thing just blows my mind. I mean, I've hooked up well over 1,000 people myself now. And I'm sure many other people, many other practitioners have. Look, it never fails to be in a subjective-objective match. It never, not one single time have I seen somebody say, no, that doesn't make any sense to me at all, why that theta would have blown out there. They go, oh yeah, that's when. Every single time. The thing is so pure, so elegant, so organic that it's holographic. I can't even begin to explain this to anybody, what I'm trying to say here, but someday I'm going to write it down. The thing is, it's just pure consciousness. We are looking at a clear, still mirror that's perfect of the state of consciousness. And man, we don't need to meddle with it. We just need to say, you people, hey, here's the mind mirror. You're never going to find anything else like it. And find a way for more people to tap into it. I guess that's my soapbox for the day. Thank you, Neil, for making it so. We hope to see
Well,
you.
I'm glad to have everybody's discussion and listening. Have everybody listening to me. So.
We thank you for being here, for everybody for being here. It's been quite a fascinating discussion, which we, of course, will be happy to continue at any and every opportunity.
I definitely learned some new things from what you had to say about the development of the mind mirror, how it works. Yeah, been useful, very useful.
Great, glad to hear it. Yeah, it's a difficult subject, deeper in there, you know.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.